Although it can work with 8-bit and 16-bit images, the exposure effect is really designed for 32-bit images. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the exposure effect, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about bits per channel. I'm not going to explain bits and all that kind of stuff really in depth. For that, you can go to After Effects CS3 Beyond the Basics. But what we're going to do here is talk about the exposure effect, which is almost impossible to do without at least a brief mention of bits per channel. So what we can do to toggle through these bit depth modes is to Alt or Option click on this little area right here to cycle through them. There's 8, 16, and 32 bits per channel. If you are brand new to color depth, essentially what that means is the amount of colors. So the most common image file format or bit depth for footage is 8 bits per channel. 8 bits per channel contains much fewer colors than does 16 or 32 bits per channel. This makes a big difference when you're actually getting in and adjusting and playing with the colors, as we'll see with the exposure effect. Now we have here a camera raw image that I took. So it's at 16 bits per channel. So that's why we have our project at 16 bits per channel. You cannot set bit depth on a per comp basis. It has to be done on a per project basis. So now I'm going to add the exposure effect. And the exposure effect is attempting to simulate the exposure of a camera. So kind of like the aperture. The manual for After Effects says that this exposure value is supposed to be in like f-stop increments, as if you had an f-stop on your camera. But I find that this is not really exactly the case from my experience. This is much more sensitive than a real aperture on a camera would be. Also, with f-stops, as you decrease the number, the exposure increases. And here with exposure in this effect, as you increase it, it actually gets brighter, which is more intuitive for After Effects, but not really true to the way f-stops work on cameras. So I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit, and you can see it's a very natural effect. It's almost like I had a better lens or I used a longer exposure time or what have you. That's basically what the effect does. For the offset parameter, it basically attempts to play with shadows and midtones while leaving the highlights alone. So if I take this to the left and take this down, whoa, look at that mess. What's happening here, folks, is that the exposure effect is not built for 8 to 16-bit channels. It's built for 32 bits per channel images or footage. So if we go back to our project panel and Alt or Option click on this to get this into 32 bits, we'll see a really rich, powerful image with no clipping and weird artifacts and that type of thing. Now, to really take advantage of 32 bits per channel, you kind of need to have source footage that's 32 bits per channel, which is often hard to come by. But what you can do is another alternative. Let me show you something else. I'm going to Alt Option click this one more time. And this time I'm going to go over to another composition made up of a couple shape layers that I made. And basically this is just a circle and a star and fiddled around with in shape layers. I mean, I love shape layers and I still don't think I really have a hold on all their capabilities, but it's amazing you can create something so intricate and complex with just 2 simple shape layers made from just a circle and a star. It's amazing. But anyways, this is now an 8-bit per channel image, and I have here an adjustment layer. And I'm going to add the exposure effect to this adjustment layer here. Actually, it was already applied. Let me just go ahead and delete that. I forgot that I'd already done that. Here's the deal, folks. When you make stuff from scratch in After Effects, like shape layers or text or what have you, that stuff has the capability of being natively 32-bit, as if it were taken with a 32 bits per channel camera or what have you. Whereas with a photo or other footage, you're going to be limited if you didn't start out with 32 bits per channel. The stuff in After Effects that you make from scratch here doesn't have such limitations. So watch this. Again, we're in the standard 8-bit per channel mode. I'm going to take exposure to 1, and I'm going to take offset to -0.1, just a little bit. And look at that ickiness. That's just disgusting. The reason is because it cannot handle the processing capabilities of exposure. However, if I go back to the project panel and I Alt Option click and take it into 16 bits per channel mode, not really much of a difference here. Do it one more time. And look at that. The shape layers can process in 32 bits per channel. So we have these glaring glows and these really deep shadows that we couldn't get in 8 bits per channel mode. We could even push the exposure more on this. It would almost be like flooding the scene with real world light. So essentially, yes, the exposure effect just kind of brightens and darkens more or less. But at the same time, it's a 32-bit effect that can process in HDR, in other words, 32 bits per channel. By the way, you could also change the channels, speaking of channels, in the exposure effect from master to individual channels This will gray out the master area, this top area that we've been dealing with up here, and will allow you to get in here to each individual color channel and have exposure, offset, and gamma controls for each individual color channel. And one last note before we close this movie here, the help recommends that if you manage color manually using the color profile converter effect, then you enable this bypass linear light conversion option. But if you're not doing all that stuff with the manually doing color, blah, 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 then don't even worry about that. The bypass linear light stuff, it usually doesn't look as good when it's turned on. So unless you really know what you're doing about color and you're using the color profile converter effect, then just leave the bypass linear light conversion unchecked. And that's exposure.